The message was barely a page long, but by the time Meghan reached the final line, the meaning was impossible to misunderstand. The royal patronages she had once hoped could return to her orbit were not being restored. They were being reassigned, and the name beside every one of them was Princess Charlotte. What looked like a routine palace decision suddenly carried the emotional force of a verdict, reopening an argument many believed had already been buried. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan lowered the paper and stared at the same line again. Harry stood close enough to see the list but said nothing. A royal patronage is an official relationship in which a member of the monarchy supports a charity or public cause, making this far more personal than a reshuffling of names. These roles carried trust, history, and a recognized place inside the working royal family. Every patronage she had privately asked to recover had been placed into Charlotte's future portfolio. Meghan pushed the document away and left her tea untouched. "Everyone?" she asked. Harry took the paper, read the entries himself, then checked the final page for an exception. There was none. Buckingham Palace had approved a fictional succession of patronages plan, allowing Charlotte to assume the responsibilities gradually as she grew older. The causes were not being held open for Meghan. Charlotte's name made the rejection harder to process. Meghan could have fought an older royal over status, but the young princess had made no demand and taken no side. That left her with nowhere clean to place her anger. She was devastated, not because Charlotte had won something from her, but because the palace had chosen a child's future as the place where her former royal work would continue. Harry kept reading, and one detail changed the room. The patronages had not been divided among several senior royals. They had been grouped deliberately into one future portfolio, creating a single line of continuity around Charlotte. Then he reached the note that mattered most. William had reviewed the proposal before the final communication was sent. Meghan looked up immediately. William had not merely learned about the arrangement afterward. The future king had seen the structure before it reached California, meaning his judgment sat somewhere inside the choice on their table. Harry understood the question before she asked it. Why had his brother believed Charlotte should inherit precisely the responsibilities Meghan wanted returned? That question pulled the story away from paperwork and into something far more dangerous. The unresolved history between Meghan, Harry, William, and the young princess placed at the center of it. Charlotte had made no demand, issued no challenge, and entered no palace argument. Yet suddenly her name carried the weight of a family fracture, years older than she was. For Meghan, the announcement represented a door being permanently closed. For William, it represented preparation for the monarchy his daughter may one day help sustain. And for Harry, seeing those two realities collide created perhaps the most painful position of all. William understood that his daughter occupied a strange place inside the royal future. Princess Charlotte stood in the direct line of succession, the legal order determining who could eventually inherit the crown. But barring extraordinary circumstances, George was expected to carry that burden first. Her importance would therefore be shaped less by sovereignty and more by service. The prince wanted that service to mean something. He wanted substance, history, and causes she could grow into, rather than ceremonial appearances with no deeper purpose. Meghan saw the same list and felt something completely different. Her fictional request had never been only about prestige. She wanted selected former causes restored, because those relationships represented proof that leaving frontline royal duties had not erased every meaningful connection she once held. Harry watched her circle Charlotte's name with a pen, then stop. He understood immediately. She did not resent the child. She resented what the decision seemed to declare about her own permanent exclusion. Catherine found William studying the portfolio after dinner and quietly sat across from him. No aides were present. She asked whether he understood how the decision would look outside palace walls. He did. Yet the future king insisted that their daughter needed a coherent path, not a random collection of duties assembled years later. Catherine had already argued privately for the same principle. Charlotte should inherit causes that connected naturally, allowing her future work to develop with purpose rather than convenience. That agreement, however, carried an uncomfortable shadow. Earlier drafts of the plan had not centered everything on Charlotte. Sophie, Anne, Catherine, and several younger royals had appeared across different versions, each receiving pieces of the old portfolio. A royal portfolio simply means the group of charities and public responsibilities assigned to one person. Somewhere between those early drafts and the final decision, the names disappeared until only Charlotte remained. Harry sensed the significance immediately. Someone had transformed a practical redistribution into something far more symbolic. Meghan's former place had not merely been divided among working royals. It had been gathered beneath the future of William's daughter. Catherine knew how that could be interpreted. William knew it too, and the reason for that change led back to one private exchange months earlier. A conversation so tense that palace planners would later treat it as the moment Meghan's requested return became impossible to restore. Long before Charlotte's name appeared on the final page, one private meeting had already changed the direction of the decision. It began as an attempt to settle practical questions about charity work, and ended with William leaving convinced that the old royal arrangement could not be revived. No shouting reached the corridor. No dramatic statement followed. Yet everyone who later touched the patronage file would eventually trace the rupture back to that single conversation. Harry entered the Windsor meeting carrying Meghan's structured request, and still believed compromise was possible. Windsor, in this context, meant the royal estate where senior family discussions could take place away from public attention. The proposal asked for renewed links with several organizations once connected to her royal work, without restoring her full position as a working royal. To Harry, that distinction mattered. To William, it created the very problem the palace had spent years trying to avoid. William listened carefully before answering. Crown-linked patronages were official relationships tied to active royal representation, not simply private charity work. The prince feared that returning them publicly would blur the boundary created when Harry and Meghan stepped away from frontline duties. Meghan could support causes independently, he argued, but official patronage carried the authority and identity of the crown with it. Harry pushed back immediately. Meghan had invested years of energy into causes that mattered to her, and he insisted that history should count for something. William closed the folder, removed his glasses, and chose his words slowly. Sentiment, he said, could not determine how the monarchy presented itself. Harry heard the sentence as something colder than policy. He heard it as a judgment on whether his wife's past service still belonged anywhere inside the institution. The tension hardened. Harry told his brother that Meghan wanted any restored roles recognized publicly, not quietly reduced to private support. William replied that this was exactly why the request could not work. A royal title attached to a cause meant representation of the crown, and the future king would not create a halfway position that looked official when the wider role was not. Harry stood to leave. Then William mentioned Charlotte. The prince said some dormant patronages might eventually form part of his daughter's adult service portfolio. Harry stopped at the door. Suddenly the argument was no longer about holding old roles in reserve. It was about moving them into another generation entirely. William remained behind after his brother left and dictated a short memorandum, a formal written recommendation used to record a position for later decision-making. In it, he advised that the contested patronages be treated as future crown responsibilities, rather than preserved for any possible return to Meghan. Months later, that memorandum would resurface at the center of the final plan. And this time, William would not be able to hide behind files or policy, because Meghan wanted his reasoning from William himself. When Meghan finally faced William, she did not begin with accusations about titles, hierarchy, or old grievances. She asked one question: why Charlotte? The simplicity of it stripped away every layer of palace language surrounding the decision. William knew exactly what she meant. Why had responsibilities Meghan once carried, and later asked to reclaim, not merely been denied, but placed together beneath his daughter's future name? Harry had arranged the private conversation because he feared silence would make the resentment worse. Only a small number of staff knew it was happening, and no statement had been prepared. William entered knowing the discussion would be painful. A royal patronage, an official link between a royal and a charity or public organization, had returned to crown control after Meghan stepped away. To the prince, that meant the roles could now be reorganized around future royal service. Meghan refused to let the explanation hide the emotional cost. She asked whether he understood how humiliating it felt to see every cause she had requested placed beneath Charlotte's name. William said he understood the symbolism, but he would not accept the idea that his daughter had been chosen as punishment. Charlotte had never been part of the dispute, he insisted, and she would not be raised to believe she had taken something from anyone. Meghan's voice stayed controlled until she spoke about the people behind those patronages. She remembered relationships, conversations, and years of work that could not be reduced to a palace chart. The decision, she told William, made it feel as though her service could be transferred, repackaged, and remembered without her. Harry had warned him this was how she would hear it. Now the future king was hearing the wound directly. William placed both hands flat on the table when Meghan finally asked whether he had personally supported the final structure. Silence followed. Then he answered, yes. He did not blame courtiers or advisors. He admitted that he had supported consolidating the portfolio around Charlotte because he wanted his daughter to grow into a serious role with purpose. William explained that George would grow up preparing for kingship, while Charlotte would need to understand that her own duty still mattered. Kingship meant the responsibility of eventually serving as sovereign, something George was expected to prepare for over many years. The prince wanted his daughter to inherit causes with history and weight, not ceremonial duties assembled at random. Meghan left still wounded, but the uncertainty was gone. William had shaped the plan himself, and that admission pushed the conflict toward the only person whose approval could make it permanent: Charles. The prince could recommend the future, but only the king could turn that recommendation into royal policy. The most consequential moment did not come during an argument. It came with Charles sitting alone before a document that required little more than his approval. On one side was the emotional history of a son who had left and a daughter-in-law asking for part of her old public life back. On the other was William's blueprint for Charlotte's future. The king could not preserve both, and he knew it. Charles studied Harry's written appeal before touching the pen. In this fictional royal structure, the king's approval mattered, because crown patronages were being reassigned as part of a long-term working plan for the monarchy. A patronage was an official relationship linking a royal to a charity or public cause, and changing those relationships meant deciding who would publicly represent the crown in years to come. That made the document far heavier than its few pages suggested. William's position was clear. The future king had argued for continuity, firm boundaries, and a structure that would prevent confusion over who officially represented the monarchy. Harry had argued for something more personal. He wanted Meghan's history with selected causes to count, insisting that charitable links could survive, even if her old working role did not. Charles understood both men, which made choosing between them harder. Charles asked his aide to leave and read the appeal again alone. He remembered the strain surrounding Harry's departure, and knew another refusal would never be heard as a simple administrative decision. Meghan would hear years of distance inside it. His younger son would hear another door closing, yet the monarch also feared that restoring official roles without restoring full royal duties would create uncertainty the family had already paid dearly to escape. The king did not simply accept William's proposal unchanged. He added a phased timetable for Charlotte, making clear that she would not receive the full portfolio at once. The young princess would first observe, learn, and take on age-appropriate responsibilities before any formal transfer occurred. Charles wanted duty to grow with her, not descend on her as a reward for an adult family dispute. Charles finally reached for his fountain pen. The signature was brief. Its consequence was not. By approving the redistribution, he ended any possibility that those crown patronages would remain open for Meghan's future return. The king set the pen down, but kept one hand on the file. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he called his private secretary back and quietly instructed him to send the final notice. That decision now belonged to the crown, not merely to William's recommendation, and Harry had to carry the hardest part of it home, telling Meghan that Charles himself had closed the door. Once the king's signature dried, the argument stopped being theoretical, and inside their home, the consequences became painfully immediate. Harry returned to Meghan with no loophole left to offer. Charles had signed. William had accepted responsibility. Charlotte's future portfolio was settled. For the first time, the dispute could no longer be explained as a temporary pause, a misunderstanding, or a decision that another conversation might reverse. Meghan had wanted an answer. Now she had one, and the finality of it hurt far more than the uncertainty ever had. Harry placed the palace letter in front of her and explained what had already begun. The affected organizations were being told that future royal representation would eventually pass into Charlotte's portfolio, while existing working royals would handle responsibilities in the meantime. A royal portfolio meant the group of charities and public duties assigned to one member of the family. That structure mattered because it turned an internal decision into a future plan the palace was already preparing to carry out. Meghan read the letter slowly. When Harry told her that Charles had personally approved the arrangement, she did not tear the page or raise her voice. She folded it once, carefully, and held it for several seconds. She had expected rejection, she admitted. What she had not expected was replacement so complete that every cause she had asked about now pointed toward Charlotte. Harry felt the conflict immediately. He understood William's argument that his niece would someday need a serious role with purpose, especially as George prepared for a very different future. Yet he hated what the arrangement had done emotionally. Charlotte's future service had become tied to Meghan's sense of loss, and he knew the child had done nothing to deserve that burden. Meghan stopped him when he began talking about whether they should respond publicly. She refused. Any angry statement, she said, would drag Charlotte into a dispute created entirely by adults. Her frustration remained sharp, but so did her restraint. She would not turn a young princess into the face of her rejection simply because the palace had placed the girl's name on the other side of the decision. Then Catherine's message arrived. Meghan read the short personal note twice. Catherine made one point clear. Charlotte had not been told about the dispute behind the portfolio, and she would never be encouraged to see those patronages as something she had won from anyone. The message did not reverse Charles's signature. It did not restore a single role, but it changed the temperature. Meghan placed the folded letter inside a drawer and looked back at Harry. For the first time since the decision arrived, neither of them spoke about fighting it. Something else had opened instead. The first genuine shift came only after the argument fell silent, when Meghan and Catherine finally spoke without husbands, advisors, or palace language standing between them. There was no negotiating table this time, no palace memorandum, and no brother standing between them. Meghan and Catherine spoke woman to woman about the one person neither wanted damaged by the dispute, Charlotte. What began, stiffly softened when Catherine admitted that she had worried the announcement might look cruel. Meghan, still wounded, admitted something equally difficult. Her anger had never truly been directed at the young princess whose name now occupied the list. Catherine had reached out because she understood how easily the story could harden around her daughter. A royal patronage was an official connection between a member of the monarchy and a charity or public cause, and Charlotte could one day inherit several of them with no knowledge of the bitterness surrounding the decision. The princess wanted her child's future service to begin with responsibility, not the belief that she had displaced someone inside her own family. Meghan agreed to speak because she no longer expected the decision to change. She told Catherine that seeing Charlotte's name repeated across the list had felt harsher than a simple refusal. It seemed as though the institution had preserved the work while carefully removing the possibility that she might ever return to it. That distinction mattered. She could accept losing a role. What hurt was feeling that the role itself had been allowed to survive without her. Catherine did not argue with the pain. She listened, then said something Meghan had not expected to hear. "She must never think she won something from you." The words landed differently because they separated Charlotte from the decision around her. Catherine made clear that the child would never be raised to treat future service as a victory over another woman's loss. Meghan's response was quiet. She said that was the first sentence anyone had spoken that made the decision easier to carry. Then she asked for something surprisingly small. She did not ask for the patronages back. Instead, she wanted the organizations to preserve an honest record of everyone who had served them before Charlotte, so the future would not be presented as though it had begun from nothing. Catherine agreed. She promised to raise the principal with William and Charles, not as a challenge to the redistribution, but as a way to protect continuity. The patronages would still remain part of Charlotte's future, yet the emotional meaning could change. What had felt like replacement might instead become inheritance, with memory attached. That fragile understanding would soon face its hardest test. Once the arrangement became public, newspapers and broadcasters would strip away every careful distinction. Private understanding may soften a family wound, but outside royal walls, nuance rarely survives the first headline. By sunrise, the palace's carefully worded announcement had been reduced to something far sharper. Broadcasters called it a generational handover. Commentators called it a closing door. Social media turned Charlotte and Meghan into opposing symbols, despite neither woman describing the decision that way. Then one newspaper front page appeared on newsstands near Buckingham Palace, and its enormous headline captured the public mood in 5 brutal words. Charlotte inherits Meghan's royal legacy. Meghan had already seen the digital edition before Harry placed the newspaper on the kitchen counter. Buckingham Palace had described the plan as a long-term restructuring of royal service, meaning Charlotte would gradually assume selected public responsibilities as she matured, rather than taking them immediately. That distinction mattered, because it framed the decision as preparation for the future, not punishment for the past. But the public conversation moved faster than the palace could control. Meghan stared at the word inherits and winced. To her, it transformed Charlotte into the winner of a contest the young princess had never entered. Harry understood immediately why the wording hurt. Years of argument over departure, duty, and belonging had been compressed into a simple story of one woman losing while another gained. The emotional history surrounding their break from royal life overwhelmed every careful explanation in the official announcement. William reacted with anger of a different kind. He watched a live broadcast from Buckingham Palace and saw Charlotte's photograph placed beside Meghan's as commentators debated who had gained more from the decision. The prince reached for his phone and called Catherine, insisting that the palace make clear their daughter had played no role in selecting the portfolio. He would defend the plan, but he would not allow Charlotte to be presented as having defeated her aunt. Outside the palace gates, the public mood became impossible to ignore. Television crews broadcast a small gathering as one woman raised a handwritten sign reading, "Let Charlotte serve. Leave the child out of the feud." The image spread across broadcasts throughout the afternoon, capturing the discomfort surrounding a dispute that had suddenly placed a young princess at its center. Charles saw the coverage and authorized a supplementary statement. The king emphasized continuity of charitable service and formally recognized the work of previous royal patrons, making clear that Charlotte's future responsibilities were not intended to erase anyone who had served before her. The public storm had changed the argument. No one could reverse the decision now. The only question left was whether the family would allow Charlotte's future to become another monument to division, or finally separate her duty from the wounds that came before it. In the end, nobody got everything they wanted. Meghan did not regain the crown patronages she had asked to recover. William could not prevent his daughter from becoming entangled in the family's unresolved history. Harry could not undo the decisions that separated his old royal life from his present one. Yet from the wreckage of that argument came one clear agreement. Charlotte would inherit the responsibility, but she would not be asked to inherit the resentment attached to it. Meghan returned to the folded palace letter she had placed away earlier and read it again without the same anger. The patronage decision still stood exactly as approved, meaning Charlotte would gradually assume the full portfolio as she matured. A royal portfolio was simply the group of charities and public responsibilities assigned to one member of the family. Meghan's request was now definitively closed, but the meaning of that closure had changed. Charles approved Catherine's proposal that each organization preserve a formal history of the royals who had supported it before Charlotte. The king understood why that mattered. Meghan's past work would not be erased, and the young princess would not be asked to begin her own service by pretending no one had come before her. Catherine had wanted continuity without humiliation, and the monarch agreed. Meghan looked at Harry and admitted that losing the patronages still hurt. But she no longer saw Charlotte's future role as a personal attack. She should make them her own, she said, closing the letter one final time. Harry understood the weight of that sentence. His wife had not received the restoration she wanted, but she had refused to pass her disappointment down to his niece. William made the same choice from the other side of the divide. He told Catherine that Charlotte would eventually learn the history honestly, but never as a story about defeating Harry or Meghan. The prince wanted his daughter to understand that service began with humility, not triumph. When he later gave Charlotte an old briefing folder, he treated it not as a prize, but as the first hint of a responsibility she would one day have to earn. Harry and William also reached a narrow peace in a private conversation. The younger brother said he still disagreed with how the decision had been handled. The future king admitted he had underestimated how powerful the symbolism would become when every disputed patronage was placed under one name. Neither man reversed his position, but both stopped trying to win the argument. That became the true meaning of Charlotte's inheritance. Royal roles could continue even when the people holding them changed. Meghan left without the patronages she wanted, but with her contribution acknowledged. Charlotte gained responsibility without inheriting the feud. William secured a meaningful future for his daughter, while Harry helped prevent bitterness from reaching another generation. And that was the lasting verdict of the crisis. Meghan lost the patronages she wanted returned. Charlotte inherited their future, and the family finally chose not to make a young princess carry the weight of an older generation's wounds. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.